My name is Claire Anderson. I'm 36 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I tried to make my father proud. I thought if I worked hard enough as a teacher, if I gave my students everything I had one day, he would finally see me. But at his retirement gala in front of 220 guests, he erased me with a single sentence. He called me the greatest disappointment of his life. My seat at the VIP table was given to his glamorous stepdaughter, along with the $6 million education trust he once promised me. I stood there trembling as the cameras flashed and the room stared, wondering if I would break. And then when it felt like I had lost everything, his old boss stood up and revealed a truth that turned the entire ballroom upside down. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. I still remember the way the chandeliers glowed that night, spilling gold across the ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Boston. The entire place shimmered like a jewel box, every corner polished to perfection, every detail designed to impress. There must have been over 200 guests, the kind of crowd my father adored. School board members, retired principals, benefactors in tailored suits, reporters from the Boston Globe's education desk, even a couple of city council members in attendance. This wasn't just a retirement party. It was my father's coronation, a public farewell to his 30 years as a principal, and he wanted the whole city to know it. I walked in on the arm of Susan Miller, my colleague and closest friend. She wore her best navy dress, the one she'd used for her daughter's graduation, and I had chosen a deep green skirt and cream blouse. We both looked presentable, but compared to the gowns and tuxedos surrounding us, it was obvious we were from the teacher side of town. I smoothed down my skirt and tried not to let the contrast get to me. I had told myself over and over that this night was about celebrating my father, about honoring his career. Still, a tiny hope fluttered inside me that maybe finally he would acknowledge me, his daughter, who had followed in his footsteps into education, even if my classroom was far from glamorous. My eyes landed on him immediately. Richard Anderson, 66, was holding court near the stage. His Armani suit was perfectly cut, the silver at his temples catching the light in a way that made him look distinguished. At his side stood Linda, his wife of 5 years, dressed in a gold evening gown, her neck dripping with diamonds. She was the picture of high society Boston, poised and smiling as though she had trained for this moment. And then there was Vanessa, Linda's daughter from her first marriage, 29 sharp in every sense, wearing a scarlet dress that seemed designed to command attention. People turned as she passed her, laughter just loud enough to be noticed. My father beamed at her like she was the brightest star in the room. I felt Susan shift beside me. "You okay?" she whispered, reading me too easily. I nodded quickly. "Yeah, just taking it all in." My voice was steady, but inside I felt the old ache, the familiar reminder that I was always background noise in my father's grand performances. Still, a stubborn piece of me held on. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe tonight he would finally say, "This is my daughter Claire, the teacher who carries on my legacy." We made our way deeper into the ballroom, past tables dressed in white linen, each centerpiece a tower of fresh orchids. Waiters floated by with trays of champagne. I could hear a photographer snapping photos near the entrance where my father and Linda posed like royalty, Vanessa always finding a way to slip into the frame. Susan leaned toward me. "This place probably costs more than my yearly salary." I let out a breath of a laugh. Try 2 years. Still, I kept walking, trying to keep my chin high. I wanted to be proud of him. I wanted to belong. When we reached the front of the room, I scanned the long VIP table set closest to the stage. Place cards, each in elegant script, gleamed under the lights. Richard Anderson, Linda Anderson, Vanessa Carter, David Chen, chairman of the Anderson Education Trust, 2 major donors, a couple of city officials. I scanned again, then again. My name wasn't there. Confused, I bent lower, running my finger across each card as if maybe my name had been misspelled. But no, it simply wasn't there. There were 8 chairs, 7 place cards, and 1 empty seat right beside Vanessa's card. The kind of seat that should have been mine. My father had promised me years ago that when the time came, I would step into his place on the board. I had researched proposals, spent weekends drafting scholarship ideas, and now at his grand finale, I wasn't even worth a card on the table. "Maybe it's at another table," Susan said softly, but her tone carried doubt. I stood frozen, staring at the empty chair as if it could explain itself. All around me, people laughed, clinked glasses, carried on. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears, the humiliation rising even before I had the words for it. I turned my head toward the stage where my father was adjusting his tie, preparing to greet yet another donor. His eyes passed over me like I wasn't even there. That was the moment it struck me harder than it ever had before. Tonight wasn't just about celebrating his career. Tonight was about erasing me from the story entirely. And the erasure had already begun, one missing name card at a time. Linda's voice slid into my ear like silk lined with barbs. "Oh, Claire," she said, her smile bright enough for the donors nearby to notice. "We had to make some last-minute changes. That empty chair is for Vanessa. She has stronger ties with the legal and corporate world. It only makes sense she's up front tonight." Her tone was casual, practiced, but the words landed like stones. I felt every pair of eyes at the table glance at me, waiting for my reaction. My father shifted beside her, tugging at his cufflinks, his gaze fixed somewhere over my head. He didn't contradict her. He didn't say my name. He just nodded lightly, like this was perfectly reasonable. Vanessa leaned forward, draping her manicured hand across the back of David Chen's chair. "David and I were just talking about reforming how the trust allocates funds," she said, with the crisp authority of someone already assuming power. "We'll need more corporate partnerships if we want real impact." David gave a polite smile, listening, but guarded. My father chuckled as if to endorse her point, and my chest tightened. I stood there for a heartbeat too long, waiting for someone, anyone, to insist there had been a mistake. No one did. A young woman in a black dress appeared at my side, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Anderson, your seat is this way," she said kindly but firmly, leading me toward the back of the ballroom. I followed, my heels clicking against marble, each step heavier than the last. Table 14 was tucked behind a massive pillar. When I sat down, I realized I couldn't even see the stage without leaning awkwardly to the side. Around me were other teachers from the district, each in their best outfit, still looking slightly out of place among the satin gowns and custom suits. The tablecloth was thin polyester that clung to my skin. The chairs were the kind that wobbled if you shifted too much. The comparison to the front table was brutal. Theirs shimmered with silk crystal glasses lined like soldiers, gold-rimmed plates gleaming. I tried to breathe to gather myself. Susan sat beside me, her eyes sharp as she scanned the room. "This is intentional," she whispered. Before I could respond, Linda's voice carried across the music, perfectly timed for the donors huddled around her. "Vanessa just closed a major case in Manhattan," she announced proudly. "Historic, really. And Claire, well, she's still teaching at a public school." Isn't that sweet? My throat closed. Heat rushed to my face. Public school. She said it like it was a disease. I felt the teachers around me stiffen in their chairs as though embarrassed on my behalf. No one said anything. No one ever did. I kept my hands folded in my lap, nails pressing into my palms hard enough to sting. I told myself to sit tall, to breathe, to survive the moment, but I couldn't stop the image of the satin table at the front flashing in my mind, the empty chair beside Vanessa's, the chair that should have been mine. Vanessa threw back her head, laughing at something David said. The sound traveled across the ballroom like a bell, polished, deliberate. People turned to look. I shifted in my seat, suddenly painfully aware of my own second-hand dress bought years ago for a teacher award dinner no one in this room had attended. Susan leaned closer, her voice low and steady. "Don't give them what they want," she murmured. "They want you small." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the sense that the entire room already saw me that way. Small, unimportant, hidden behind a pillar. My father raised his glass to toast Vanessa's achievement. Cameras flashed. and at my table the shadows seemed to deepen, pressing down as if to remind me exactly where I belonged. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to flee. My face burned as though every single person in that ballroom was staring, even though most weren't. To me, it felt like a spotlight had been turned on the fact that I was not and never would be part of the show. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation around me faded into a blur, and my mind pulled me backward through years of small betrayals that had stacked up like bricks in a wall between me and my father. I could see myself at 23 standing in a cap and gown outside the education building at Boston University, clutching my diploma with both hands. The June sun had been so bright it hurt my eyes, but the ache in my chest hurt more. Richard hadn't come. He had emailed that morning a curt note about a last-minute trip with Linda. "Congratulations, Claire. I'll call when I'm back." He never did. I smiled through the pictures with Susan, with my professors, with the friends whose parents were beaming beside them. I told myself it was just bad timing that he was busy, but the empty spot where he should have been carved itself into my memory. The reel of memories didn't stop there. 5 years later, I turned 28. I wasn't expecting balloons or a parade, just maybe dinner with my dad, a chance to sit across a table and talk. Instead, I got an email 2 days late. "Happy belated? Hope the classroom's going well." That was all. No phone call. No card. Nothing personal. Linda had tagged photos online that same week. Richard on a weekend trip to Cape Cod, smiling beside her, a glass of wine in his hand. Then there was the year everything should have been different, 2018, the night I received Boston's Teacher of the Year award. My students had nominated me, parents had written letters, colleagues had cried during the ceremony. I remember standing on that stage, the plaque in my hands, thinking this was the moment he'd finally show up. He didn't. I later found out he was at a dinner celebrating Vanessa's appointment at a Manhattan firm. It was important networking, he told me afterward, his voice dismissive when I tried to hide how crushed I felt. "Your event was just for teachers." Sitting there now at table 14, hidden behind a pillar, I felt all those absences pressing down on me, heavier than the polyester tablecloth brushing my knees. Every missed moment, every shrug of dismissal, every time he chose someone else, Linda, Vanessa, anyone, over me it all layered into this single night. I had forgiven him more times than I could count, telling myself he was distracted, that he carried heavy responsibilities. But the truth was harder. He had always decided I wasn't worth the time. Susan must have seen the way my face tightened, my jaw clenched. She leaned close, her voice soft but steady. "Don't forget," she whispered, "you've touched hundreds of children's lives. That's real legacy, not cocktail parties." I looked at her, my throat thick, and nodded. Her words wrapped around me like a blanket in the cold, reminding me of the thank you cards piled on my desk, the crayon drawings, the hugs from parents who told me I'd changed their child's life. Those were victories my father had never asked about, never wanted to hear. Still, a stubborn ember of hope glowed inside me. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe he had overlooked me in the seating chart but would redeem himself from the stage call. My name acknowledged my work, let the room know that I wasn't invisible. I stared toward the bright lights and the silk-draped table at the front, the place where I should have been, and whispered to myself, "This time, maybe." But in the deepest part of me, I was already bracing for disappointment. My father tapped the microphone, his voice carrying easily across the cavernous ballroom. "Good evening, everyone," he began, and the crowd hushed with practiced respect. He stood tall under the spotlight, his silver hair gleaming, his tone both authoritative and warm, the voice of a man who had commanded classroom staff meetings and boardrooms for 3 decades. He launched into stories of his early years teaching history in a cramped classroom on the South Shore, making jokes about the outdated chalkboards and broken radiators. The audience laughed in the right places, charmed by his wit, charmed by his ability to make 30 years of bureaucracy sound like an adventure. He spoke of challenges he had overcome, budget cuts, unruly school boards changing state mandates, and of triumphs, the schools he had turned around, the programs he had created. Every detail was polished, carefully chosen to present the image of a man who had given everything to the community. I watched him remembering the man who had once brought me flashcards and quizzed me at the kitchen table, the man I had thought I would grow up to emulate. But standing there, basking in applause, I realized how far away that man felt. When he shifted into the personal portion of his speech, my heart began to pound. Of course, he said, his smile widening as he gestured toward the front table. I couldn't have done any of this without my family. My wonderful wife Linda, who has been my anchor these past 5 years, always steady, always gracious. The crowd clapped politely, Linda dabbing at her eyes with a napkin as if on cue. And my daughter, he continued, turning to Vanessa, who I've come to think of as my own. Watching her rise in her career has been one of my proudest joys. She is proof of what ambition and excellence can achieve. The applause this time was louder, the cameras flashing as Vanessa stood giving a graceful wave, her red dress catching the light like fire. My father's eyes shone with pride, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as she sat down again. I waited. My pulse quickened. My palms slick against my lap. Any second now he would turn and add, "And my daughter Claire, who followed me into education." It would be simple a sentence, a nod enough to prove I wasn't invisible. But he moved on. And now he said, straightening his shoulders, "I'm thrilled to share the future of the Anderson Education Trust." The crowd leaned forward, anticipation buzzing. This was the big announcement, the reason the donors and board members had gathered. My breath caught. This was it. The promise he'd made to me years ago, the words that had kept me working late nights drafting scholarship proposals. The reason I'd believed there was still a place for me in his story. He paused for effect, smiling as though savoring the moment. After careful thought and consideration, he said, his voice swelling with importance, "I'm proud to announce that my successor on the board will be Vanessa Carter." The room erupted in applause, thunderous and sustained. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, photographers jockeying for position as Vanessa stood again, waving her smile, dazzling her arm linked through David Chen's. Flashbulbs popped like fireworks, immortalizing her triumph. I couldn't move. My body felt hollow, my stomach dropping as though the floor had given way beneath me. My father's promise, my years of preparation, my sacrifices, erased in a single sentence. He hadn't even hesitated. He hadn't even looked in my direction. Susan's hand closed over mine, firm and grounding, but I barely felt it. My own hand trembled, my vision blurring with the bright lights and the endless clapping. I sat frozen in the shadows of table 14, hearing the roar of approval for Vanessa, watching my father's smile widen, as if he had never had another daughter at all. I pushed my chair back from table 14, the scrape loud enough to make heads turn. My legs felt heavy as I walked across the ballroom, but I forced each step forward, threading between the clusters of donors and administrators, until I stood at the edge of the long, silk-draped table. Conversations dulled, replaced by curious silence. "Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "you promised that seat to me." Richard looked up from his plate, his smile faltering for just a second, before hardening into the mask he always wore in public. "Claire," he said, his tone clipped, "this isn't the time." "No," I answered louder now, my hands trembling at my sides. "You told me years ago that I would carry on your legacy, that my classroom experience mattered. That was your promise." A few phones lifted into the air. Guests leaned closer. Linda set down her champagne glass with a deliberate clink. Her lips curved into a smirk, as sharp as broken glass. "Claire, really? A public school teacher managing an education trust. Be serious. You spend your days with crayons and spelling tests. You don't understand strategy. You don't understand capital. Vanessa does." My breath caught, but before I could respond, Vanessa leaned back in her chair, one arm draped across the backrest. Her voice carrying just enough for the room to hear. "She's right. Managing millions of dollars isn't about heart. It isn't about good intentions. It's about influence, legal expertise, and knowing how to work the right rooms. That's why I was chosen." Laughter rippled from the end of the table where two donors exchanged knowing looks. Heat rushed to my face, but I stood taller, refusing to shrink. Richard straightened his tie and met my eyes, his voice cutting like ice. I had high hopes for you. But you've settled. You've hidden in a classroom content with scraps. That's not ambition. That's complacency. And it is not what this family represents. The words struck harder than any blow. I heard a collective intake of breath around the table, the kind that comes when people realize a line has been crossed. I stepped closer, gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles whitened. I have given my life to those children, I said, my voice trembling with fury. I've stayed up until 3 a.m. designing lesson plans. I've spent my own paycheck on books and supplies. I've fought for kids who had no one else. If that's not ambition, then tell me. What is? Richard's jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed, not with shame, but with cold anger. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it more dangerous. You are the greatest disappointment of my life. Gasps echoed through the room. I saw the flicker of phones recording little red lights blinking as strangers captured my humiliation for posterity. Linda's smile widened, satisfied. Vanessa adjusted her hair, basking in the attention as though this public execution elevated her. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt crushed, my ears roaring. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, to escape the stares, the whispers, the evidence forever stored on strangers' devices. My eyes burned, but I swallowed hard, forcing the tears back. I would not give them that. Susan appeared at my side, her hand brushing against my arm in quiet solidarity. Her eyes were blazing, though she said nothing, knowing any words would only feed the spectacle. I stood there, torn open, my father's verdict hanging in the air like a death sentence. The room waited for my collapse, but all I allowed myself was one shaky breath, a lift of my chin, and the silent vow that if they wanted me broken, they would be waiting a very long time. The silence after my father's words felt suffocating, a weight pressing down on me from every direction. But then I noticed the shift in the air. Phones lifted higher, little red recording lights, blinking whispers, swelling into something sharper. The humiliation wasn't private anymore. It was public, alive, spreading across the ballroom. A man's voice broke through the tension. This is wrong. I turned and saw Tom Rodriguez, head of the teachers' union, pushing back his chair at a nearby table. He walked toward me, his broad frame steady, his eyes locked on my father. A teacher with real classroom experience deserves that position more than a lawyer who's never stepped into a school. A murmur rippled through the room, heads turning toward Vanessa. She stiffened, her smile faltering. Richard's face flushed crimson. Before anyone could respond, another voice rose above the crowd. My daughter's life changed because of Claire Anderson. Mark Stevens said, stepping forward from a cluster of parents near the back. His voice shook with anger, but carried across the room. She struggled with reading until Claire gave her the confidence to believe in herself. You think that's not worth a seat on the board? Shame on you. The applause started hesitantly from one corner, then spread like fire. It wasn't the whole room, but it was loud enough to rattle Linda, who set her glass down with a sharp clink. This is not the place, she hissed, her voice rising, but the momentum had shifted. Susan was suddenly at my side, her hand pressing against the small of my back. Stand tall, she whispered. Don't let them push you out. Not tonight. 2 security guards in black suits appeared, moving with professional calm. Ma'am, we'll need you to step outside, one said, his hand hovering near my elbow. The sight of him. The implication that I was the disturbance here made my stomach twist. I'm not causing a scene. I said, my voice low but firm. I'm answering 1. The taller guard repeated, Please come with us. His eyes were polite but unyielding. I glanced around the room at the faces watching. Some stared with thinly veiled curiosity, others with quiet sympathy. But then I caught sight of the teachers at the back tables, their eyes fierce, their nods small but deliberate. Parents clutched their phones, recording their mouths tight with indignation. I took in a shaky breath and pushed back my chair. For a second I thought I would walk away, let them escort me out and disappear into the shadows where they had always tried to keep me. But then I felt the weight of all those gazes. Students, parents, colleagues who knew what it meant to buy supplies from our own paychecks. Strangers who understood what it meant to be dismissed. My knees trembled as I rose, but I didn't bow my head. I squared my shoulders instead. The guard stepped closer, ready to guide me out, but I lifted a hand and stopped him. "I can walk on my own," I said. The room hushed again. I could feel the energy pressing in, waiting for me to crumble, to vanish quietly like an afterthought. But when I looked up, I saw Tom still standing, his arms crossed like a sentinel. I saw Mark with his jaw set in determination. I saw Susan's eyes steady on mine, blazing with pride. For the first time that night, I didn't feel alone. And that changed everything. Enough, a deep, steady voice rang out from across the ballroom, the single word cut sharper than the clinking of glass or the shuffle of heels, and the room went still. I turned toward the sound and saw Edward Williams rise slowly from his chair near the middle tables. At 71, his hair was more silver than white, his frame lean but commanding. He had once been the superintendent of the Boston public schools, a man my father used to call his mentor, his guide. Seeing him there, standing tall and clear-eyed, sent a jolt through me. "This cannot be ignored," Edward said, his gaze sweeping the room before fixing on my father. "Not tonight." The chatter evaporated. Phones tilted toward him, cameras pivoted. A ripple of recognition spread as guests whispered his name. My father stiffened at the head table, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wineglass. Linda's painted smile faltered. Vanessa adjusted her posture, folding her hands in her lap with a composure that looked rehearsed. Edward stepped forward, not rushing his presence, filling the silence. "For those who don't know me, I am Edward Williams. I served this district for 40 years. And more importantly," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "I stand here tonight as a representative of the Future Learn Foundation, the primary sponsor of the Anderson Education Trust." The words landed like a stone dropped into a pond. Gasps fluttered through the room. Someone near me whispered, "Future Learn. They're the ones funding the $6 million. My heart leapt into my throat. Linda's hand flew to her necklace. "Edward," she said, her voice higher than usual, "surely this isn't—" But he lifted a hand, silencing her without raising his tone. I listened quietly as this evening unfolded. I watched a daughter dismissed in favor of someone with no teaching experience. And now I must remind everyone here that the trust exists because of Future Learn's commitment. That commitment has conditions. Richard finally stood, his face rigid, though a bead of sweat glistened near his temple. "Edward, this is my event," he said firmly, though his voice didn't quite fill the space. "We can discuss foundation matters in private." "No," Edward said, his voice firm but calm. "Not in private. Not when promises have been broken in public." He turned to David Chen, who sat 2 seats down from Vanessa, frozen in his chair. "David, bring me the contract. Now." David hesitated, his eyes darting between my father and Edward. He shifted uncomfortably, then reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a folder, the thick kind with tabs and signatures poking out. His hands shook slightly as he handed it over. Edward accepted the folder with deliberate care, tucking his glasses from his pocket and sliding them on. He glanced at the first page, then lifted his eyes back to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "I believe it's time everyone hears exactly what this agreement entails." The ballroom held its breath. I could feel the anticipation pressing in every camera, fixed, every whisper silenced. Richard's jaw tightened, his face pale under the bright lights. Linda shifted in her chair, her nails tapping against the tablecloth. Vanessa forced a smile that looked more like a grimace, and Edward began to read. Edward flipped to a tabbed section of the contract, adjusted his glasses, and began to read in a voice so clear it seemed to reverberate off the chandeliers. "Section 7.3, he said, pausing just long enough for the room to lean in. "At least one member of the board must be an actively serving teacher or an individual with demonstrable classroom experience." The words hit like a gavel strike. A ripple of shock moved across the tables. My chest tightened, air rushing into my lungs in sharp bursts. Edward didn't stop. Furthermore, compliance with IRS regulations and established ethical standards is mandatory. Any breach of these provisions nullifies sponsorship obligations. Gasps filled the space, followed by murmurs that grew louder with each second. Phones were everywhere now, red lights blinking, recording every syllable. He turned toward Vanessa, his gaze sharp enough to cut. "Tell me, Ms. Carter, how many days have you taught in a classroom?" Vanessa's smile wavered. A bead of sweat glistened at her temple. She shifted in her chair, fingers tightening around her napkin. "That's not my field," she said quickly. Her laugh brittle. "My expertise is law. I bring connections." Connections? Edward's tone sliced through her words. "This is an education trust, not a cocktail circuit. You've never stood in front of a class, never met a struggling child's eyes, never been responsible for teaching a room of students to read." The crowd stirred. Someone whispered loudly, "She's never even been in a school." Richard rose from his seat, voice booming, trying to reclaim the authority slipping from him. "Edward, with all respect, this is about the survival of the fund. We need someone with influence, someone who can open doors." "This isn't about doors," Edward shot back, his voice ringing louder. "It's about children." "And you?" Richard signed a binding contract knowing exactly what those terms were, terms you've now chosen to ignore. Linda stood abruptly, her gold gown shimmering under the lights as she pointed a finger across the table. "This is an ambush, an orchestrated attack on our family. You're twisting the facts to embarrass us in front of donors." Edward closed the folder with deliberate calm. "No, Linda. I am stating the facts. Richard Anderson has breached his obligations under this agreement, and as the primary sponsor, Future Learn Foundation exercises its right to withdraw all financial support." The words dropped like a hammer. A collective gasp swept the ballroom. A few guests clapped a hand over their mouths, others muttered in disbelief. My father's face drained of color, his lips pressed thin, his eyes darting as though searching for an exit. $6 million, gone in an instant. Vanessa's composure shattered, her hands trembling as she tried to keep her smile in place. "This is outrageous," she hissed. "You can't just strip the trust of funding like that." Edward cut her off with a raised hand. "I can, and I have, effective immediately." The room erupted. Donors whispered furiously, some rising from their chairs, reporters scribbling, cameras flashing like lightning. All I could do was sit frozen, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the chaos. For the first time that evening, it wasn't me under the spotlight of humiliation. It was them. And the night was far from over. The ballroom exploded into chaos, 100 voices all rising at once. Phones were raised higher, the glow of screens bright against the dimmed chandeliers. Reporters shoved forward, shouting questions over one another. I could see the little red dots of live streams flickering across the room, the humiliation of my family being broadcast in real time to anyone who cared to watch. Vanessa's phone buzzed violently against the table. She snatched it up, her face draining as she read the screen. Another buzz, another message. Her jaw tightened, her fingers trembling as she typed a reply. But then her shoulders sagged. She looked up at Linda, her voice thin. "It's the firm. Clients are pulling out. They're calling for a disciplinary review." Linda gasped, the sound sharp and theatrical, and stumbled back against her chair. Her champagne flute slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. The liquid spread like a stain, and whispers hissed immediately from the surrounding tables. "Careless," someone muttered. Just like their arrogance. Richard stood frozen at the center of it all, his face pale, his hand clutching the back of his chair as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. The man who had once commanded school assemblies and faculty meetings with iron confidence now looked hollow, as if the ground had opened beneath him. His lips moved, but no sound came. He shook his head slowly, muttering, No, this can't. David Chen rose deliberately from his seat, adjusting his glasses, his voice firm enough to cut through the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," he said, and the room gradually quieted, though the tension still thrummed like a live wire. Given tonight's revelation, the board will convene an emergency meeting immediately following this gala to review the breach of contract and to determine the future of the trust. The announcement landed like another blow. Conversations reignited, people leaning in to whisper furiously, cameras flashing. Richard swayed on his feet, his knuckles white as he gripped the chair harder. I watched him, unable to look away. This was the man who had once stood on a pedestal in my life, now shrinking under the weight of his own choices. The proud principal, the flawless figure in my childhood memories, was unraveling before 200 witnesses, and however many thousands more watching online. Across the table, Linda bent down to pick up the broken glass, her movements jerky. Her smile plastered back on, though her eyes darted wildly. Vanessa sat rigid, her phone buzzing again and again, each vibration another nail in the coffin of her image. And me? I stayed seated at table 14. Susan's hand steady on my arm, my pulse racing. The storm was no longer mine to weather. The spotlight had shifted, and every pair of eyes in the ballroom was now fixed on my father, waiting to see how a man who had humiliated his own daughter would face humiliation of his own. Edward's voice rang out above the murmurs, firm but warm. "The one who deserves this seat, this responsibility, is Claire Anderson, no one else." For a moment I couldn't breathe. My name hung in the air, filling the silence that had swallowed me all evening. Then Tom Rodriguez stood, clapping loudly, his face resolute. Mark Stevens followed his voice, breaking with emotion as he shouted, "She saved my daughter's life." Susan's hands came together next, fierce and proud, and soon the entire cluster of teachers at the back tables joined in their applause, echoing like thunder. Parents stood calling my name, raising their phones not just to record, but to cheer. My throat tightened. After years of being dismissed, minimized, shoved to the side, suddenly the voices in the room weren't ridiculing me. They were lifting me. David Chen stepped forward, clearing his throat, his tone measured but decisive. "Given this turn of events and the breach of contract, I propose the immediate formation of a new entity, the Claire Anderson Teaching Excellence Fund, a foundation that will be led by someone who understands the classroom firsthand." The room erupted again. This time the applause wasn't hesitant or scattered. It rolled forward like a wave swelling until the chandeliers rattled with the sound. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them back, forcing my voice steady as I rose. "If I can help more classrooms, more children, more teachers," I said, my words trembling but clear, "then I am ready. I am willing. I will do it." Gasps, then more applause. I saw flashes from cameras reporters scrambling to capture every word. Out of the corner of my eye, Richard slumped into his chair, pale and hollow. Linda's lips were pressed so tight they'd turned white. Vanessa stared down at her phone, her jaw clenched, her hand frozen mid-scroll. Susan squeezed my hand. "Go," she whispered. The lights shifted, following me as I stood fully. Table 14. The forgotten corner had become the center of the room. My legs shook as I walked toward the stage, but with each step the applause grew louder, steadier, until it felt like the entire room was carrying me forward. I reached the steps, the silk of the stage curtain brushing against my arm, and for the first time that night, I lifted my chin into the glow of the spotlight. From the shadows of exile to the center of the stage, I walked into the light, every eye on me. Not in mockery, not in dismissal, but in recognition. 3 days later, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Headlines filled the screen before I even had my first sip of coffee. The Boston Globe splashed the story across its front page. "Principal Richard Anderson loses legacy amid funding scandal." The smaller outlets followed quickly, each headline sharper than the last. society wife, frozen out of Boston's elite circles. Star Manhattan lawyer suspended. Pending review. Every paper, every blog, every newsfeed carried some version of the same truth. My father's empire had collapsed in a single night. The live stream of the gala had gone viral, 1.5 million views in just 2 days. Clips of my father declaring Vanessa as his proudest joy were paired with the footage of Edward stripping $6 million from his trust. The contrast was brutal, replayed again and again on every screen. And then there was the hashtag. Teachers deserve respect trended across Twitter, Instagram, even the evening news anchors used it to close their broadcasts. I scrolled through messages from teachers all over the country. Third-grade teachers in Chicago High School, English teachers in Dallas, kindergarten teachers in Seattle, all telling me they felt seen for the first time. Linda's fall was as swift as my father's. The Boston Society pages that once adored her now tore her apart. Photographers caught her leaving a luncheon alone, her face half hidden by oversized sunglasses, her friends melting away overnight. Vanessa's punishment was harsher. Her firm announced an indefinite suspension, citing ethical concerns. I heard through colleagues that at least 3 major clients had pulled out within hours of the gala footage circulating. Meanwhile, I was pulled in the opposite direction. The Massachusetts Teachers Union invited me to speak at their upcoming conference. Parents stopped me in the grocery store, pressing my hands and thanking me for standing up. The Boston Herald ran an op-ed titled, "Why Claire Anderson Represents the Future of Education." And then Edward himself, standing beside me at a press conference, placed his hand on my shoulder and declared into a sea of microphones, "Claire is the future of community education. The proof is in her students, her passion and her resolve." Flashbulbs blinded me, the sound of cameras snapping rapid fire as I sat at a long oak table in a downtown office and signed the papers to establish the new fund. The Claire Anderson Teaching Excellence Fund became official with the sweep of a pen. Each stroke echoed louder in my chest than the applause had that night in the ballroom. This time, no one could take it from me. As I looked up, the flashes kept coming, reporters calling my name, parents and teachers clapping from the back of the room. My face was warm under the lights, but I didn't shrink. Not this time. I had been shoved behind pillars, dismissed at my own father's table, called his greatest disappointment. Now those same cameras captured me as something else entirely. A symbol, an advocate, a woman who refused to disappear. The image of me bent under humiliation at the gala felt like another life. And the woman staring back from the reflection in the pressroom window, pen still in hand, was its opposite. A mirror image turned right side up. A daughter my father could no longer deny, no matter how hard he tried. 6 months later, the fund had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. 85 scholarships had already been awarded to young educators pursuing advanced degrees, and 120 classrooms across Massachusetts had received grants for supplies, books, and technology. Every week, letters poured into my office. Thank you notes from teachers who could finally afford field trips, from principals who no longer had to beg parents for copy paper, from children who now had brand new books of their own. And yet, despite the press conferences, the board meetings, the television interviews, my favorite part of every day remained the same room 3B at East Boston Elementary. My classroom, the place where 28 third graders filed in each morning, dropping backpacks and stories about their weekends. I still knelt by wobbly desks to tie shoes, still stayed late to help a child sound out a stubborn paragraph, still taped spelling words to the walls with the same care as always. One Monday afternoon, as I erased the board after math, I felt small arms wrap around my waist. It was Daniel, the boy who had once thrown pencils in frustration when he couldn't read. Now he was clutching a paperback novel to his chest, grinning up at me with a missing tooth. "I finished chapter 4 by myself," he said proudly. I bent down, hugging him back. "I told you you could do it." His eyes sparkled, and in that moment I knew no gala, no foundation, no amount of money would ever feel more important than this. At dismissal, parents crowded the doorway, some stopping to shake my hand, others simply saying, "Thank you." Their gratitude was quiet, but it filled the room more completely than applause ever had. I thought back to the night I sat at table 14, hidden and humiliated, and felt the sharp contrast settle deep inside me. Recognition, I realized, doesn't come from a satin tablecloth or a spotlight. It comes from here. Chalk dust on my fingers, children tugging at my sleeves, parents trusting me with their sons and daughters. That was my legacy, and it had always been enough. Walking home that evening, the late autumn air crisp against my cheeks, I let the thought play again and again in my mind. The seat at the front of the ballroom had never defined me. The classroom always had. So if you've ever felt pushed aside, diminished by your family, or overlooked at work, I hope my story reminds you of this. Your worth isn't measured by the seat you're given at someone else's table. It's written in the lives you touch and the quiet impact no one can take away. I'd love to hear your own experiences. Have you ever been underestimated by your family or dismissed in your profession? Share your story with me. Let's keep this conversation alive and shine a light on the teachers, nurses, caregivers, and countless others who give everything, yet are too often taken for granted. Together we can remind the world those who serve in silence deserve the loudest respect.